Well, as you well know, tensions between the US and Iran are usually always high, but with a varying degree of severity. However, over the last few weeks, there's been a dramatic spike of mysterious incidents at military sites, nuclear facilities, pipelines, hospitals, and even forest fires that many here have attributed to clandestine US activities designed to destabilize Iran. And those are just some of the domestic incidents I mentioned. Across the region, there's been a flare-up again between the US and Iran-backed Shia militias on an almost daily basis. Now, most recently, Iran accused the US of terrorism and vowed revenge when last week, they say, an Iranian passenger jet on the way to Beirut from Tehran was harassed by two US Air Force F-15s over Syrian airspace. The Iranian version of events is that the US fighter plane came dangerously close to the passenger jet, forcing the pilot to make an emergency maneuver to avoid a collision, which subsequently resulted in the injury of several passengers. Cell phone footage shot from inside the plane shows someone lying on the floor motionless, another man seated with a bloody face, while other passengers can be heard screaming and shouting in panic. Now, unsurprisingly, Alison, the U.S. narrative is very different. A spokesman for Central Command said that a single F-15 fighter jet conducted a visual inspection of the airliner at a safe distance before flying off. And just to underscore how anxious Iran is about the possibility of some sort of kinetic military action with the U.S., the Iranian Navy conducted a drill today in the Persian Gulf where they launched missiles against the mock-up of the USS Nimitz. Then Iranian commandos fast-roped down from a helicopter onto the mock Nimitz. An attack against a replica USS carrier is something that they've only done a few times in the past decades, and it's always been at a time of heightened tensions. Interestingly, Alison, Iran's president yesterday said that Washington had reached out to Iran 23 times over the last 2 years to try and talk, thinking that Tehran would buckle under the pressure. But Rouhani said their plan backfired as Iran managed to resist. And the reality is that the U.S. hasn't been able to change the regime here, nor have they been able to change the regime's modus operandi, but they have put them up against the ropes. The ruling establishment is under enormous pressure. They no longer wield the influence they once did in Syria and Iraq. They can't sell their most valuable commodity, oil, for anything near what they used to sell it for. The economy is on the brink of collapse, and there is a perpetual feeling here that protests may flare up at any moment over a whole range of issues, not least of all the economy.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.